As a teacher as well as a human being, a question always comes to our mind that how a child learns. Not only child, we all learn something every time, sometimes formally in a system, sometimes informally or indirectly. But whenever this learning takes place, as a teacher, you may think that how does learning take place? To explain the process of learning, there are a number of theories. Few explains learning as a change in behavior, we call them behaviorist theories. Few are cognitivist theories. And nowadays, a lot more importance is being given to constructivist theories. But every theory tries to explain the process of learning in its own way. And among the initial theories, or you can say the classical theories, the first such important theory is known as conditioning theory or classical conditioning theory. Today, we are going to discuss about this classical conditioning theory. And you know who has given this theory? This theory was given by Ivan Pavlov. And actually, Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist, he was a physiologist. He was actually studying the process of human digestive system and digestive system of other animals. And during an experiment on the digestive system of dog, he suddenly realized that some digestive processes are starting with some stimulus. And he tried to establish a relationship between, a connection between a stimulus and response. And thus this theory came. Because this is the first theory in the area of learning or learning theories, that's why we call it as classical or classical conditioning theory. But it is basically a connection theory, a connection between stimulus and response. That's why we also call this theory as SR theory. Right. Before understanding what the classical conditioning is, what are its implications, how it works, let us try to understand the common terminologies which was used by Pavlov to explain this theory. As you can see on slides, there are a lot of pictures with some captions. Let us take the example of food and salivation. For salivation, bell is not a stimulus. Well is neither positive stimulus nor negative. Well has no relationship with food or with hunger or with salivation. So that's why bell is known as a neutral stimulus. Whereas food, which is a natural stimulus for salivation, that's why we call food as natural stimulus or unconditioned stimulus. No conditioning is required for food to start the process of salivation in your mouth. Even if you fond of some eating things, like someone like rasgulla, someone like some other sweet, someone like some special vegetable, and you take the name, the saliva will come in your mouth. So food is a natural stimulus for salivation. Similarly, salivation is a natural or unconditioned response for food. But if it happens due to well, then it is conditioned response. So you can see that one term is neutral stimulus, bell is a neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus is food. When bell is connected with food, it is conditioning, we started conditioning. Conditioning means transfer of characteristic of one stimulus to another stimulus. So when we connect bell with food, it becomes conditioned stimulus. So if saliva is coming while watching the food, it is unconditioned response. But if saliva is coming only hearing the voice of bell, it is conditioned response. In order to understand these terminologies, let us try to see that what Pavlov has done. You can see in the picture, Pavlov was basically experimenting the degree of saliva to be secreted in a dog during the digestive process. We all know that when we saw the food, we eat the food, saliva comes in our mouth and saliva helps in digestion of food. So, he was basically trying to see that what degree or what amount of saliva comes at what state, and what he observed. He observed that when food is being given to the dog, immediately saliva comes out. And what he did, he connected a device to count the drops of saliva, and there was a revolving drum which was recording the responses, that how much degree of saliva is secreting when dog is watching the food. When he was doing this experiment, actually what he noticed, that after some repetitions of this, the moment he entered with a cup of food or bowl of food in the room, only by hearing his footsteps, saliva starts coming. He used a bell. First he rang the bell, then he entered in the room to give the food. So what he noticed, after some time, the dog started secreting saliva only by hearing the sound of bell, even not dog has seen the food. So, in order to understand it, you can see in the picture that before conditioning, when food was coming, food was basically an unconditioned stimulus. When food was coming towards the dog was secreting saliva, means salivation process takes place. So saliva was unconditioned response for food, which was unconditioned stimulus. So food was stimulus, saliva was response, food was natural or unconditioned stimulus, and saliva was unconditioned or natural response. But if only well is being used, which is a neutral stimulus, no salivation takes place. If there is no food, only bell is being rang, no saliva will come out in the buccal cavity of dog. But what he observed, but he first rang the bell, when he first rang the bell and conditioned it with the food, the salivation takes place. When he repeated this experiment several times, what he noticed, that after the repetition, the saliva start coming in the buccal cavity of dog, even only hearing the sound of bell. So now bell become conditioned response, because the characteristic of food was transferred to bell. So he was very surprised. He studied this up to a large extent. He did many minute observations. He changed even the frequency of bell. He added one more conditioned response for higher order conditioning. But what he tries to explain, he tried to explain that if something is being associated with some new natural thing, the characteristic of the natural thing may be transferred to a neutral thing. I am giving you one more example which you may have observed around you. Suppose a police officer is going from same route in the same car from his or her one office to another office, and the policeman at the traffic post on the duty, whenever he or she see the car or the officer in the car, salute. The conditioning becomes so much that even many times only car passes and the traffic man or the policeman salutes without giving a focus that if there is someone in the car or not. You can see a lot of such examples like in your classroom. Many times the students who are chit-chatting and they are talking with each other when class is empty, and a teacher comes at a particular time. So whenever they hear the footsteps of the footsteps of the or the sound of the footsteps of the teacher, they become silent. Even teacher is not entering in the class. If teacher is passing by from the corridor, the moment the students hear the sound, they become silent. This is called conditioning. So when this conditioning took place, a lot of processes are being recorded by Pavlov. One such process is generalization. Means the behavior occurs in presence of other stimulus similar to the conditioned one. You can take the example of bell, that even the stimulus similar to bell, even the sounds similar to bell, even a different sound of the bell can cause same kind of response or same kind of salivation in the dog. But it happens only at the initial levels. Later, when the higher degree of conditioning takes place, this generalization turned into discrimination. Means the dog started to discriminate between the main conditioned stimulus and other related stimulus. Means the frequency of the sound. You ring 10 types of bell and dog will identify which bell is correct for food. So salivation will take place only when the dog will hear the sound of that particular bell. So that kind of specification or discrimination takes place when this practice goes on. Like the example of footsteps, sound of the footsteps of teachers. Initially it may happen that if one teacher is coming or any other teacher is coming, the student's response is same. But later on students will realize or they will identify, they will be able to discriminate that which particular footstep, sound of footstep is of their teacher. That is high degree of conditioning. So not only the generalization takes place, but later on the generalization move towards discrimination. The third such important process is extinction. If the process of being given the conditioned stimulus is repeated so many times without giving the unconditioned stimulus, means the fading of the desired behavior on repetitive presentation of conditioned stimulus without associating it with the unconditioned one. Let me give you again the example of food and dog. If the characteristic of food is being transferred to the bell and salivation starts with the sound of bell, but if you do 10 times, 20 times that you only create the sound of bell and you will not give the food to the dog will stop salivation after few attempts. Means dog will realize that no food is coming, only bell is ringing. So the characteristics which are developed or which was transferred in the bell will fade away. This is called extinction. Again with the conditioned stimulus, the behavior reoccurs immediately. This is called spontaneous recovery. So what Pavlov observed? Pavlov didn't talk about only conditioning, but Pavlov tried to explain all the associated processes, and with these explanations, with the process of generalization, discrimination, extinction, spontaneous recovery, Pavlov identified the important processes which are involved in any learning. Now the question may come that Pavlov has done all the experiments on dog. Pavlov was doing something in the physiology. He observed something and he presented his observations and he proposed a kind of explanation of learning. How is it applicable in classroom situation? Or what are the classroom implications of Pavlov theory? So, the important educational implications of Pavlov theory are, number one, for developing good habits. How you can develop good habits by following Pavlov's learning theory. What Pavlov suggested? Pavlov suggested that you associate an unconditioned stimulus with one neutral stimulus. So if you want to bring certain positive changes in the behavior of your learners, your students, you can associate any such stimulus with a natural stimulus to achieve your desired goal. You can associate something with book reading, you can associate something with writing work, you can associate something with discussion or debate. You can have a lot of options. Similarly, if you want to develop the positive attitude of learners towards learning, this theory helps. Because this theory talks about connections. Connections of something which is not natural with something which is natural. So if you want to make learning as a natural process, or if you wish that your learners should adopt the learning as a process and they follow all the steps of the learning, initially you can associate it with some conditioned stimulus. This helps in eradicating tension and fear among the children. You may have observed, especially in with the smaller kids in the classroom, that some kids may have a fear of darkness. Some kids may have fear of some sound. Some kids may have a fear of being alone at one place. These are very common fear which you can observe in your class, especially with the smaller kids. You can use the conditioning suggested by Pavlov to eradicate or remove such kind of fear from the children. Next very important implication is that it helps in the readjustment of those children in the classroom who are maladjusted, who are not well adjusted, who are maladjusted children. You can associate some good habits, some conditioned stimulus with their natural processes, and the result will be that the adjustment will begin. But because it was the first theory, it was the first learning theory, it did not explain each and every process of learning. So there are some shortcomings, or you can say limitations of this theory too. The first such limitation of Pavlov's classical conditioning theory is that there is no explanation of the learning of gifted or intelligent children. Why? Because every time children didn't learn by stimulus response connection. This is applicable for the children upper childhood age, or you can say adolescent age, but not very smaller kids or infancy age. Number two, the child who learn himself or herself due to their intellectual abilities or spatial capacities. So those learning processes are not being explained by Pavlov. Because Pavlov's theory is based on connection between stimulus and response, so there was a lot of stress on repetition or recapitulation of the activity. So drill and exercise was also part of this theory. As Pavlov explained that if you remove the unconditioned stimulus from the conditioned stimulus for some time, the behavior which was due to the conditioned stimulus may fade away or extinction may take place. So people often say that if every learning process is being governed by the classical conditioning theory or by the principles of classical conditioning theory, then there are chances that whatever the children have learned may not be stable. So the learned facts may not be stable, they may fade away or extinction is possible if connection is not much strong. Sometimes students forget when reinforcement is withdrawn. This is very important thing. Because until or unless you are giving reinforcement continuously, they will keep learning. The moment reinforcement will be withdrawn, they may forget what they have learned. And one very critical criticism of Pavlov conditioning theory is that every learning does not take place only by exercise or only by stimulus response connections. Especially in case of the learning of human being, a lot of learning takes place due to insight, but there is no explanation about insight. A lot of learning takes place after developing the understanding about the fact or concept, but there is no explanation of understanding in the Pavlov's theory. There is no discussion or talk or association of the interest of learner with the learning in this theory. And this theory also not address the role of aptitude in learning. So overall you can say that though there are limitations, though there are criticism, but what Pavlov has suggested, that how a child can learn, what can be the role of stimulus and response, how stimulus can be connected with response, how desired responses can be achieved. These are very critical questions in the area of learning. And when you deal with the learners in the classroom or even outside of the classroom, you can often find the situations or the scenario where you can find the application of Pavlov's classical conditioning theory. So, in this theory, you need to remember the types of stimulus, means the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, and the responses, the unconditioned responses and conditioned. The response remains same. Salivation is a response. If salivation is due to food, it is unconditioned response. If salivation is due to bell, it is conditioned response. Then what is the role of extension? How spontaneous recovery takes place? What is the role of generalization? How discrimination develops when you keep on giving the exercises, same types of exercises to your students, to your learners in different activities. So these are very important concepts which you need to understand, which you need to keep in your mind while planning your teaching learning, while delivering in the classroom, or while designing any activity to facilitate the learning among your learners. I hope that today's discussion will help you in understanding the basic principles involved in classical conditioning theory, and you will be able to apply these principles in your classroom teaching learning. Thank you. Thank you.